Okay, welcome everyone to the Seleukid lecture series, edition 9.5. And well, this is the last edition this year, this academic year and this calendar year. After 39 events that we've had with over 40 talks, we started this, this outlet of Seleukid scholarship and friendship in May 2021 in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, as we were missing our friendly gatherings of the Seleukid study days. So we are now looking forward to have the next Seleukid study day upcoming in November, 11th to or 12th to 15th November in Utrecht. The title will be The Afterlife of the Seleucids, Receptions and Reinterpretations from Antiquity to the Present. And a preliminary program is already on on our website. So we are very much looking forward to many of you joining there. And then in the winter, we want to resume our regular Seleukid lecture series. Now, today we are expecting three distinguished speakers, two of which, Rabbi Ben Scolnic and Professor Graham Wrightson, will present the paper Each Event on a Proper Scale, Polybius on Antiochus III's Campaign in Baktria. So Ben is very well known as my co-host of this lecture series and also the co-editor of the Seleukid Perspectives volume series. He has published, dozens of books on Daniel, the Maccabees, and also the Seleucids, but he may be seen as relatively new in the field of ancient war studies, thanks to the co-edited volume, The Seleucids at War, published not a full year ago. However, in fact, whoever studied the Maccabees, biblical studies in general, and also the Seleucids has constant contact to ancient warfare. However, one of the leading scholars in the history of warfare, even beyond Hellenistic and ancient history, that is clearly Graham Wrightson, professor of South Dakota State University. And he has published, written or edited, co-edited over 10 books by now, including, I think his most important book was The Combined Arms Warfare in Ancient Greece from Homer to Alexander the Great and his successors. And one sequel to this volume was his book on the battles of Antiochus the Great, the failure of combined arms at Magnesia that handed the world to Rome, published in 2022. Graham is active in so many fields. Most of all, he is one of the organizers of the annual interdisciplinary conferences, Many Faces of War. He's also the founding president of the Midwest Ancient Warfare Network. So he has a lot going on, and I think one of his most important projects right now is a book series on, let me read it, a multi-volume series on warfare in the Near East. So there's a lot more to expect from Graham. So these are our two speakers for today, to be followed by a response by Professor Michael Taylor, also quite well known to our caucus. And his main expertise is actually Roman warfare, Roman Republican warfare, but that, of course, also involves a lot of Hellenistic warfare. So his first monograph was actually a biography on Antiochus III. And his second book, probably his most important and most influential, is Soldiers and Silver, Mobilizing Resources in the Age of Roman Conquest. Michael, we are looking forward to listening to your response after the presentation. But enough from me. Ben, I think you will be going first. The floor is yours.
Okay. Can hold on. Can you see that? Yes? Yes. Okay.
Mhm.
So, thank you, Altay. And I just want to mention that this project actually started because of Michael Taylor. Because in this book that you mentioned, Antiochus the Great, a book that I like very much, Michael has a phrase about the black hole, that at a certain point in Antiochus III's campaign to the east, there's a black hole, and I have a son who's an astrophysicist. So I was grabbed by that, and that's what really started this project. The paper itself started with a question that I asked at a conference last year. Did Antiochus III really besiege Baktra for 2 to 3 years? And I was thrilled that two colleagues, Graham and Paul Justona, were interested and offered great suggestions. And Graham was nice enough to agree to collaborate, and he's taken this project to places that I never would have gotten to myself. I'm going to tell you that right now. Okay, so in a famous passage, Polybius scolds other historians for their dramatic and inventive treatments of famous sieges and says that he will present each event on a proper scale. He says, as for sieges, descriptions of places and such matters, it would be hard to describe adequately how they work them up for lack of real matter. I should not therefore be condemned for slurring over events, when I sometimes omit and sometimes briefly report things to which others have devoted much space and elaborate descriptions, but I should rather be credited with treating each event on a proper scale. For those authors, and then he mentions two sets of sieges, and he's saying that these authors are doing this in these crazy ways. They're elaborating and everything. And he mentions a second set. So let's just take that second set of sieges. It's confusing to scholars why he would give those lists, because he discusses those sieges. So he's saying, I'm not going to do much with these sieges because other people have done so much with them. And so you'll pardon me if I sort of go in the other direction. But then, in some of those cases at least, he talks about them a lot. And so it feels like his criticism of the other historians is not so much about talking about sieges as condemning sensationalism and dramatic invention. It's not whether they should write about sieges at length, but should they exaggerate. And so he says he's going to give a true and unvarnished account, but anybody who does history knows that we all varnish with our selectivity. So to mention that that second set of sieges, he emphasizes details. When he actually talks about those sieges, he emphasizes treachery at Sardis, and Hannibal's clever strategies and loyalty and bravery. So he is often very thematic in how he talks about these different sieges. So he does not always refrain from discussing them. So in our 5 examples, in those 5 examples, Polybius gives detailed accounts of the first 2 and very little about the last 3. Now, anybody who knows anything about Polybius knows that we always have to be aware that there can be missing passages. We know that often the editors would be putting different fragments together. They don't necessarily get it right. They don't necessarily get it in the right order. And so in everything that I talk about, I understand that as a caveat, that there's always the possibility that there are passages that others are missing, that are now missing. But one of his examples, and this is what we'll focus on, is the siege of Baktra, which would seem, I'm choosing my words carefully, to be a part of Antiochus III's campaign in Baktria in the late 3rd century BCE. And we're going to examine the 2 other passages in Polybius that seem, I'm choosing my words carefully, to relate to this siege. Based on their reading of these 3 passages, that is, mentioning Baktra in that list of sieges that are sensationalized, and these other 2 that we're going to be reading, modern historians assume that the siege of Baktra lasted 2 to 3 years. The problem is that we do not see anything about that supposedly long siege. Now, there's a few possibilities. Again, I'm emphasizing we could be missing a passage in Polybius that describes the 2 to 3 year long siege of Baktra by Antiochus III. That is a possibility. Another possibility is that in trying to restore events to their proper balance, he goes too far in the other direction. That is, in veering away from sensationalistic accounts of this supposed siege of Baktra that lasted 2 to 3 years, he goes in the other direction and barely mentions it. But in the process, it winds up being Seleukid propaganda. Why? Because if you spend 2 to 3 years on a siege and you fail, and you just have to come to terms that you could have come to without any siege at all, that's a waste of 2 to 3 years in a big campaign. And so veering away from that would be by omitting that failure or by diminishing it, that would wind up being Seleukid propaganda. Now, this leads most modern historians to echo this positive analysis of that siege. All those who assume, and this is the third possibility, which I'm at least in favor of, all those who assume that there was a 2 to 3 year siege of Baktra cite Polybius as if he had given that figure of 2 to 3 years, when in fact he never did. Scholars infer a chronology because of the placement of 2 fragments at the end of books covering different years, that is, in different books, and because in that first passage, Baktra was listed as a famous siege. But Polybius may, in fact, present the events of Antiochus III's campaign in Baktria in their proper balance, just as he said he would. So we're questioning the historical fact that Antiochus III besieged Baktra for 2 to 3 years in the last decade of the 3rd century BCE. We will look closely at what Polybius says and what, as far as we can tell, he does not say. A little background. After Alexander's death in 323, leaving a large army as garrisons in Baktria, Seleukid I conquered the region between 308 and 305. His son Antiochus I was named as co-king, and he demonstrated the commitment to permanent control of Baktria by his activity, a reflection of their strong interest in the eastern part of the empire. Diodotus, a satrap and strategos of the Seleucids, took advantage of the Third Syrian War and the War of the Brothers between Seleucus III and Antiochus Hierax in 246, or around that, to increasingly grow more autonomous until he became Basileus king. There's a whole argument about when did he actually become king. It feels to me like it was a gradual process of breaking away. He was succeeded by his son Diodotus II, who ruled until some point, and we're not exactly sure, around 228 to 225, when his throne was usurped by Euthydemus. Euthydemus had been king for about 20 years by the time Antiochus III arrived. This is a point to remember when we examine the negotiations during the supposed siege of Baktria between him and Antiochus III. Antiochus III aimed to solidify Seleukid authority over the eastern. I say have that in quotes because that's what, from a Seleukid point of view, they were their own provinces, and to reestablish control, especially over Parthia and Baktria, which had become independent. There was political and symbolic importance to restoring the empire to its former boundaries. So Antiochus III moved, and I'm skipping several stages of this campaign, even though I would love to talk about those earlier stages. He moved his army into Baktria to face the rebel Euthydemus, who opposed him with a large army, including heavily armed cavalry and cataphracts. Euthydemus marched with 10,000 cataphracts from Tapuria to the Arius River to meet the Seleukid army. If Polybius is correct that Euthydemus came from Tapuria, it seems likely that Euthydemus was guarding his frontier against Antiochus III. When the news came, this is Polybius, that Euthydemus, so this is one of the other 2 passages that we're emphasizing. When the news came that Euthydemus with his army was before Tapuria, and that 10,000 cavalry were in his front guarding the ford of the river Arius, Antiochus decided to abandon the siege and deal with the situation. Since there probably is something missing there, we don't know what that siege, where that siege was. It's possible it refers to a siege that had been going on in Parthia, but it's very difficult to say. So we're not told what city he was besieging, but he marched, we do know that he marched 3 days to fight Euthydemus at the Battle of the Arius River. Euthydemus seems to have been holding the river, a natural border of Bactria, against Antiochus' crossing. Antiochus marched 3 days again to get to the river from that siege, which implies that the siege was in eastern Hyrcania or Margiana, which was in between Hyrcania and Bactria. I'm going to skip these things in the interest of time. Antiochus learned that the Bactrians would guard the river throughout the day, but at night, this again a quote from Polybius, but at night would retire to a city 20 stadia off. During his rapid night march to Tapuria, the king himself led cavalry, light infantry, and 10,000 peltasts. The fact that 10,000 infantry was considered part of his force points to the full army's significant numbers. He moved most of his army across the river under the cover of night, and was ready at dawn with 2,000 of his best horsemen, who defeated the advance guard of the Bactrians. But 2 more squadrons of Bactrian cavalry arrived and inflicted heavy losses on the Seleukid force. Seeing the 2,000 cavalry had fallen, a Seleukid officer ordered his peltasts to relieve Antiochus and inflicted losses on the Bactrians amounting to half of the horsemen and a quarter of the cataphracts. So, Antiochus wins a great victory and demonstrates exemplary courage. This is part of the Antiochus III buildup, part of the legend. In this battle, Polybius says, Antiochus' horse was transfixed and killed, and he himself received a wound in the mouth and lost several of his teeth, having in general gained a greater reputation for courage on this occasion than on any other. So while there were severe losses on both sides, it was a victory for Antiochus. So you've got a brave warrior king, huge losses, a big victory, all elements of an epic battle. It might seem that Antiochus III had now reclaimed Bactria for the Seleukid kingdom, but not so fast. Here's the last sentence of this passage at the end of the section in Book 10 dealing with Antiochus. But after this battle, Euthydemus, defeated, withdrew with his force to the city of Zariaspa in Bactria. Note that the last sentence does not say that Antiochus besieged the city or how long the siege lasted, yet scholars footnote that last sentence as indicating that the siege lasted 2 to 3 years. For Euthydemus to retreat to Balch, if that was ancient Zariaspa, and Zariaspa was Baktra, which I don't think, that's around 466 miles, or 750 kilometers. That's a very long way to retreat with an army. Marching at 30 miles a day, that would still be a 15-day march. Surely that's too far for a retreat from a battle that was not truly decisive. It would make more sense for Euthydemus to retreat the 125 miles to Merv. Even that was a 4-day journey. If Euthydemus did flee for 15 days, it would have taken Antiochus many more days to catch up, since he had to secure his supply lines and finish the sieges of other cities. It would have been a month or more before Antiochus could follow and besiege Euthydemus at Balch. Why would he just await Antiochus when the rest of his entire kingdom was still unsubdued? So as we read the next passage that we have on this war in Polybius, which is found at the end of the next book, Book 11, look for chronological markers to show the length of the siege. For Euthydemus himself was a native of Magnesia, and he now, in defending himself to Tellius, said that Antiochus was not justified in attempting to deprive him of his kingdom, as he himself had never revolted against the king, but after others had revolted, he had possessed himself of the throne of Bactria by destroying their descendants. Now, first of all, there's no mention of a siege. Second, what's missing there is some sentence or some passage that explains that Tellius, the Seleukid emissary, comes from Magnesia, or one of the Magnesias, such has been proposed by Wrightson and Walbeck, and they filled this line in to make a join between the two passages that we've read. Antiochus is sent to Euthydemus a conciliatory of peace. Tellius, a native of Magnesia, who had once been a friend of Euthydemus and came from the same country. That is, the scholars, and these are very great scholars, are trying to connect the two fragments. The idea that the sentence is missing may show where the break in the passage causing two fragments occurred, but why emphasize that Tellius, a minor character, came from Magnesia? Tellius was the perfect emissary, as he had a pre-existing relationship with the Bactrian king. It also shows the commonalities with the supposed enemy, making reconciliation smoother. But if there'd been a long, bloody siege of 2 to 3 years, why would any of that matter? While the Wrightson reconstruction that Tellius had once been a friend of Euthydemus, and that Euthydemus and Tellius knew each other from Magnesia, does seem to fill a gap, all our text actually says is that Euthydemus comes from Magnesia. If Euthydemus had been king for 20 years and had been in Bactria for a considerable time before this and had a grown son, Demetrius, who we'll meet, this would make Tellius a very old friend indeed. If Euthydemus was besieged inside the city, Antiochus was presumably right outside those walls. He wouldn't need to send an ambassador. He could just have a herald yell that Euthydemus should surrender or request or demand that he come out to meet him in person. Sending an emissary suggests some distance between them. If Tellius needs to go back and forth, perhaps Antiochus was not actually besieging the city. And so the passage continues and says that Antiochus III, is Euthydemus talking, shouldn't have anything against him because he hadn't rebelled against the Seleucids. Now, in a certain sense, that's true. Euthydemus had usurped the Deodotids, that dynasty, who had rebelled against Antiochus III. So it's, technically true. But if this was true, why wouldn't he have sent these messages to the effect saying, look, I got Baktria back for you. Why would he attack Antiochus III's army? Why would Antiochus III have invaded Baktria in the first place? When Euthydemus says that he rebelled against the dynasty, that he rebelled against the Seleucids, and that Antiochus should not be angry with him, do his words seem to follow a long period of active war between the two kings, a dramatic siege of 2 to 3 years? Even if he had not been the one to rebel after a few years of bitter conflict, the origin of the war would no longer matter. Again, this makes a long siege of 2 to 3 years seem unlikely at best. So here's Polybius again. After speaking at some length in the same sense, he begged Tellius to mediate between them in a friendly manner and bring about a reconciliation, entreating Antiochus not to grudge him the name and state of king, as if he did not yield to this request, neither of them would be safe, for considerable hordes of nomads were approaching. And this would not only be a grave danger to both of them, but if they consented to admit them, the country would certainly relapse into barbarism. Now, would the hordes of nomads have waited for 2 to 3 years of fighting between Greek forces and suddenly decide to attack? It's far more likely that after the Battle of the Arius River, the nomads were ready to invade. Euthydemus is saying, the nomads have heard about the battle, and they're coming at this moment because we Greeks are fighting. It makes less sense to say that after a 2 to 3 year siege, the tribes are suddenly a threat. Instead of thinking that Tellius' mission came after 2 to 3 years, perhaps Tellius arrived while Antiochus was still recovering from his wounds, and had already received word of the nomads appearing in his rear in Hyrcania, and so he was in an amenable mood. Antiochus agreed to Euthydemus' proposal because he'd already been invading the region for a long time now, and when reconciliation was proposed to him, it made sense. So Euthydemus sends his son Demetrius to ratify the agreement. Antiochus likes Demetrius so much he wants to make him his son-in-law. They swear an alliance. Euthydemus gets to still be called king. Antiochus is given corn and elephants, and everybody's happy. The two kings are respectful of each other. This is reasonable after one battle and the threat of an invasion of nomads, but less reasonable after 3 years of war and a dramatic siege. A little later in the passage it says, Polybius said, crossing the Caucasus, he descended into India. He renews his alliance with the Indian king, and then he reached Carmania through Drangrana, where as winter was now at hand, he took up his quarters. The campaign approached its closing stages, that is the eastern campaign, the sort of second half of the campaign, when Antiochus reached Carmania in the winter. The way the passage reads, at least to me, it was the winter shortly after the negotiations in Baktria, which must have taken place in the spring or summer, allowing enough time for Antiochus to enter India and receive the elephants from the Indian king. The way the passage reads, it was that winter. It seems possible that the battle at the Arius River and the negotiations between the kings were all in 1 year, and that Carmania is where Antiochus spent that winter. Modern historians, including a couple of very notable colleagues in very different recent papers, assume that the siege lasted 2 to 3 years. They agree with possibility number 1, that there may be a missing passage that describes that long siege. Possibility number 2 again, Seleukid propaganda. Maybe Polybius is only emphasizing the main historical result. He's transmitting Seleukid propaganda, smoothing over the 2 to 3 years of the failed siege without the kind of details sensationalized by the other historians referred to in his list. And third, so this is the passage that rounds up what Polybius says about the campaign, saying that Antiochus III is a great guy. It could not be more positive for Antiochus III. So, but our possibility number 3 is, if there was a siege at all, it was not a long siege. What happened was exactly like this narrative has it. If we simply combine the two passages, the 2 to 3 years at most could be 2 to 3 months. Now, I'm going to try to do this very quickly because I know that Graham wants to get into this, but I'm going to bring very quickly literary and editorial considerations. This is all about Polybius. What if we just read from one passage that we have to the next passage that we have? Again, using the wall bank reconstruction. After the battle, Euthydemus was terror-stricken and retired with his army to a city in Baktra called Zariaspa. Notice it doesn't say Baktra, it says Zariaspa. Antiochus sent to Euthydemus a conciliator of peace, Tellius, a native of Magnesia, who had once been a friend of Euthydemus and came from the same country as he, and then it goes on. So the whole tone of the passage between these two kings is of conciliation, respect, and eagerness to get along. And I know I'm repeating myself, but this is reasonable after one battle, but much less reasonable after 2 or 3 years of fighting. After a short period, Antiochus could be happy with this result, and there's a pattern on this Eastern campaign of him fighting a little bit and then making reconciliation and getting paid for it. There's a whole pattern. And also remember that he's got this huge army that has to get paid and fed. That one of the things that got me going on this originally was you're going to spend 2 to 3 years in Afghanistan feeding that huge army sitting outside somebody's gates, and he was a long way from Antioch. And so, as I was saying, there's a pattern that Antiochus III did in Media, Armenia, Parthia, right? And so, would Antiochus the Great have become Antiochus the Great, right, from his victories without some propaganda showing? He could have accomplished this result, this mediation, with a good ambassador and without an army. So again, I'm trying to do this quickly. Reading Polybius is very difficult, but if you know about Polybius, he'll have a book in a geographical sequence. So there's something about Asia at the end of book 10. That's that passage we read, and another passage at the end of book 11. So it seems, because you've read all this stuff in between, like there's all this time in between. But the geographical order does not match the chronological order. And there, in many cases in Polybius, the chronological order does not match that geographical order. But also, and this is again a little bit probably too detailed, book 10 covers an Olympiad, 212 to 208. Book 11 covers the events of the next Olympiad, 208 to 204. Notice that 208 is the end of one, the beginning of the other. So since what I'm trying to do is push a lot of things into 208, the Olympiad could have changed, right, with the summer solstice. And so you could actually have some of those events in book 10, the other events in book 11, and they would actually fit that chronology. Or another possibility is that an editor, under the influence of that original passage that we read about Baktra being a sensationalized siege, assumed that there was a long siege, and he placed that fragment at the end of book 11. And moderns see the fragments placed in that later year and assume that it was a long siege. So in a sense, we've got three structures going on. It's very complicated. We've got our calendar year, like when I say 208, the Olympiad system, and his geographical sequence. So the question is, was there a siege of Baktra? If there was, it seems to have ended after weeks or a few months. There's no mention of a siege of Zariaspa, and only of a campaign in Baktria, which soon ended with a reconciliation. Polybius neither provides evidence for a long siege nor for a siege that was spectacular in any regard. He does say that other historians presented a siege of Baktra as spectacular. So before I give it off to Graham, just to go over it, theory number one is there's a passage about a long siege that's missing. Two, it's Seleukid propaganda. But three, Polybius was not talking about the siege of Baktra by Antiochus III. I'll turn it to Graham.
Thanks, Ben. So I haven't made a fancy PowerPoint because I forgot, to be honest with you. So we're going to do it old school style. But I came into this because of the questions. I liked Ben's idea. And then I thought, well, if this is the case, where was this siege of Baktra, right? If it's not here, where everybody assumes it was, where else might there be a siege of Baktra that we could look for? So I started thinking about this, and it's very clear that in the first passage Ben talked about, he lists Baktra last in his list after the sieges of Carthage and Corinth, which we know were the two major sieges that Polybius is describing, and the end of the book. So it went through following all our fragments that we have of Baktra. And there's a few, various possibilities, both before and after Antiochus, that could be this infamous siege of Baktra. But the only one that seems to be described in a major way is later in the Greco-Bactrian period. And we've gone through a few other kings, which I won't bore you with the lists. But we get down to our kings after Diodotus, after Demetrius, the son of Euthydemus. We get the usurpation of Eucratidas, and we get this. The only other mention of a siege is this siege of Eucratidas by a different king, Demetrius II, of Baktra, which was short. And apparently Eucratidas survived with only a few hundred men against an army of over 60,000 or 100,000, and won, and then followed Demetrius and conquered the rest of India. So I thought possibly it was that one, but that doesn't provide any of the same sort of level of comparison that we get to Carthage and Corinth. So continuing looking, I was struck by the nomad aspect. These nomads arriving is clearly the turning point for Antiochus and Euthydemus coming to this agreement. And those nomads, as we know, were probably the Scythians, or the Saka, who've been around in this area for a long time, as I'm sure most of you are aware. And so following this through, the next major reference to Baktra is of Scythian nomadic attack in the 140s. And we know from the archaeology primarily that this happened. We get our one little source in Trogus via Justin, as you all know, that mentions nomads arriving and mentions the death of Cratidas and this sort of relatively big disaster. So looking into this a little more, we learn from the Eastern historians that this tribe of Chinese, well, their ethnicity is questionable, but this tribe that was pushed out by the Chinese Han Empire, the Yuezhi, migrated west, and they pushed out all these different tribes, including the Saka, and they ended up taking over what is Sogdiana, and we get this account of a Chinese missionary traveler, not missionary, an ambassador traveler, being sent from the Han Empire to try and persuade the Yuezhi to come and join their alliance against their new enemies. And when he arrives in Baktra in 126, he describes the Yuezhi controlling the country, although not directly, but sort of indirectly, and that there's local cities in Baktria are ruled by separate dynasts, but he comments that they're not a warlike people, they don't have a large army, there's nothing going on in Baktria. So that's a big difference from what we know of the Bactrian kingdom before, right? The Greco-Bactrian kingdom. And so something happens, and other historians before, notably Frank Holt, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, in his famous book, suggested that this Saka conquest of Baktria happened around 146, it says, and the archaeologists place this huge destruction of the city Ai-Khazum, which is hard to tell exactly which city it is we're talking about in Baktria, in terms of Hellenistic names for it, was sacked around 145. The archaeologists place it in 145. Holt suggested first that it was in 146. As we all know, archaeology is not as accurate as we would like it to be as written historians in the dating of some of these events. There's no written record of it that survived, but what we can tell from the coins and the archaeology is that there was this large invasion of the Saka nomads who conquered Baktria in 145, and then the Eastern records suggest that the Yuezhi then came down through Sogdiana and pushed the Saka out in around 130-ish, because it had newly happened after this Chinese traveler arrived in 126. So we get these two waves of huge conquest by massive armies of nomads, over 100,000 at least, if not more, which the Greco-Bactrian kingdom couldn't cope with, and was destroyed. And so this, obviously, if we take 146 as our date, then you don't need me to spell out the significance of that date for Polybius, right? That we famously have the other two sieges in our list, Corinth and Carthage, as we know, were both in 146. So if we assume this conquest of Baktria, the country, by the Saka was also in 146, then we see the destruction of a city, a huge destruction of a city in that region in the same year, then it's possible that that invasion is the infamous siege that Polybius states that other historians have written about. And obviously 146 is then a useful date because it provides neat events, 3 major sieges ending the 3 sections of his entire book, right? So you get the Sicily, Greece, Spain, Africa sections all tie up with the siege of Carthage in 146, with the end of the Third Punic War. You get the Greece and Macedon section ending with the siege of Corinth in 146, and then you would end up with your Asia and Egypt section ending with the siege of Baktra in 146. You get your three major cities, three huge sieges that are emphasized by different historians, all happening in the same year. And that's, as far as we're aware, the year that Polybius decided to stop, right? So we've known that 146 and those two sieges is why he chose to stop the other sections of his narrative. We haven't really found the ending of the Asia section, why 146 plays into that as a key period. And so we posit that, you know, this siege, this infamous siege of Baktra that he's talking about, in his list next to those sieges is the siege of Baktra, and perhaps it comes last, which I think it does, Ben can correct me, in our list, because it probably comes last in his book, where he's dealing with his last section, which is Asia. And so the infamous huge siege of Baktra may not have been 2 or 3 year siege, but it was a huge disastrous siege. And it matches, in that context, the sieges that he describes at Carthage and Corinth, where we know there was great annihilation of peoples. And if you follow the other sieges in his list, as we do in the paper, you can see that each one in his larger list, Tarentum and other places, follow these huge, changing events, right? With peoples being annihilated, enslaved, and the conquerors taking over the whole region, right? So you have the end of the Third Punic War, the annihilation of Carthage, the end of Greek independence with the annihilation of Corinth, and then the end of Bactrian independence with the annihilation of Baktra. Whichever city it was is perhaps less important as the name that the Romans in the West gave to a city in Baktria that was proverbially destroyed by the incoming hordes. And so whether that's Iconium, the only one that's been excavated, and they gave it the name Baktra because they thought it was, or whether it was Bulk, which most people think is Baktra. But the archaeology of the modern city of Balk, although because it's modern, it hasn't been fully excavated, doesn't necessarily suggest destruction. And the Chinese accounts of visiting Balk, again, they give a different name, suggest a thriving city with trade routes and merchants and everything still in place, not a city that's just been destroyed 15 years earlier. So it's not entirely clear which city may have been destroyed, but for our purposes, it was known as Baktra, as the major city of Bactria, as fitting into the pattern that Polybius has created of his three narrative segments, all ending in 146, with these three huge sieges. And so we ended in that context suggesting that we might not get the account that Polybius says he treats in his proper way, because that siege of Baktra at the end of the Asia section has been lost by those who preserved the text throughout the medieval period, didn't see the Asian section as important as the European sections, and so we lost a lot of those fragments. And as we know, we've lost a lot of that those final books. So it's entirely possible that one of the fragments that we've lost is this siege of Baktra, because our preservers didn't consider it relevant to Western history, right? Because it's only dealing with Asian nomads and Greco-Bactrians who are by then distant from the major Western powers, right? They're not relevant to the Romans or the Seleucid Empire. And so this description that Polybius might have given in the proper treatment of this major siege is now completely lost to us. And we don't have any fragments of it at all. So Ben skipped over some of the other things that we put in there, but that's basically how our paper came through to deal with the siege of Baktra. And I'll stop there from boring you all. Ben can add any more if he wants to, but I think that
was great. Thanks, Graham.
Well, I thank both of our speakers, and I now turn it over to Michael.
You're muted, Michael, by the way.
Okay, is that, I hope that's better.
Yes.
I have a not terribly consequential PowerPoint. I don't know if it's possible to just share the screen or.
Wait, I make you co-host, and then it should
Okay.
be. So now you should have the possibility. Do you see the arrow in the green field at the bottom of your screen? Share.
Yes. Okay. I've got my PowerPoint.
Yes, it's coming.
All right. And okay, let me see if I can. Nope. And let me see if I can actually now turn the. All right. Can folks see that all right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I really appreciate the invitation to respond, and I've really enjoyed this paper. And I think one of the in honor of a black hole illusion I've forgotten about. There's an image of the black hole and what glimmer we can the evidence that we can garner sort of from that penumbra of light that is observable, which is really, I think, that project today. One of the things I liked about this presentation is it reminds us how reasonable conjectures made by scholars in the past can, through a kind of insidious alchemy, transmute into proven, accepted fact. And I would say I'm guilty of this, particularly when it comes to the siege of Baktra, and I'm sure many other scholars are, in going from simply saying, well, there's a reasonable conjecture that there was some kind of extended operation around Baktra that took several years. And that is, I think, again, a reasonable possibility. And I really liked that Ben actually sort of is listing these as a sort of series of possibilities that we can work through. But too easily, I think that first possibility, that there was a lengthy siege and that we should tie together the description in Polybius book 11 with this offhanded reference in Polybius book 29. I think this is an important reminder. That's not a hard fact, as scholars, including myself, have taken. I was even just poking around the literature. I mean, people use that fact to discuss the age of Euthydemus, to discuss the history of the Bactrian kingdom, to discuss the entire dynamics of the Anabasis. But it really is just a possibility. It's a reasonable conjecture. And I'm very glad that we've been given an alternate reasonable conjecture to think about in terms of what the dynamics of Antiochus's Anabasis might have been. Moving down, this is just a map that I made. It's not terribly advanced, but it sort of is this is what you might say the canonical, I think, chronology of Antiochus's Anabasis, based on where the fragments have been placed within Polybius's text. And it's really correct. Polybius at this point is kind of a Frankenstein's monster that's been stitched together from fragments, some of which we know specifically go into some books, and some of which scholars in the past have made reasonable conjectures that it's very easy for me reading through to take as hard fact. So this is just sort of our soft dates, and of course, even if we accept the book number assignments, those dates are going to be quite soft, off potentially by a year or two or more, particularly since we don't have, say, a similar narrative in Livy, where Livy can at least sort of slot things in by consular year. Here we're left guessing, okay, where in the 4 years that Polybius is covering should a particular event go. So all of these are very soft dates. I would argue that we have at least one and maybe two hard dates for Antiochus's Anabasis. I think the uncontroversial one would be the Babylonian diary, which shows that by the spring of 205, he's back. He's back in Babylon. We can argue whether that's before or after he does his Red Sea adventure. So by 205, we know he's back. There is also the acclamation of his son Antiochus as co-king, which we can date to, I believe, Seleukid year 102, so 210 BC. While that isn't necessarily as hard, we don't know where that took place. I would suspect that that corresponds to the general soft dates of it is around 211 and 210 that Antiochus is crossing the Euphrates, plundering at Baktria, and getting ready to really step off on his expedition against the Parthians. It would make sense now that he sets his son up as co-king. So I can say that this would be the kind of hard, this expedition is really about to kick off in 210, and it's basically done by 205. So we therefore have 5 years to fill. And I would say the one challenge to the reconstruction that Ben and Graham offer here, and by the way, I'm not denying its plausibility, is if Antiochus didn't spend 2 years in Baktria, where did he spend those years? Because again, Polybius does suggest that basically after he steps away from Baktria, the expedition pretty quickly is wrapping up. He goes to India, doesn't seem to spend that long there, he winters, and then seems to be, over the course of a year, making his way back towards either the Red Sea or Babylon, depending on which order of operations he pursued. So clearly that's been one of the other seductive things about possibility one, is simply this fills some of the time if there is some kind of extended operations in Baktria. Now, admittedly, this could be that the Parthian campaign was much longer and harder fought than we've hereto believed. Again, you could argue, and I think this actually could be an argument towards the alternate chronology that's been suggested here, that if Antiochus is already engaging the Bactrians in a serious way by 208, the Parthian campaign has maybe lasted 2 seasons, which might be actually a little odd for an opponent that is routinely presented as a very, very hard, tough nut to crack, and of course an opponent that will eventually take over most of the Seleucid Empire. So it's possible, I guess actually, as you develop this further, and I absolutely hope that you do, one of the other sort of possibilities was Antiochus's campaign against the Parthians much longer and harder fought than our kind of conventional chronology suggests, which basically suggests he's got him pretty well beat by the end of 209, and is therefore ready to move to the Arius River and beyond. I could actually maybe just tentatively, however, offer one more option, maybe consider this a possibility 4. Which is there were extended operations in Baktra, but that the siege was maybe neither long nor bloody. And I guess there and maybe here I just got these pictures off the internet, so one would actually hope that at some point the world becomes more peaceful and there can be more archaeological exploration. But these are the walls of the city conventionally considered Baktra Zariaspa. And of course, I think Ben really emphasized that here we start having further layers of conjecture on, again, a whole program that is many, many layers of conjecture. Is Balk Zariaspa? Is Zariaspa Baktra? Is this the siege that Polybius is talking about? But certainly there does, if we accept these layers of conjecture, there does seem to be enough here that would suggest that there might have been fortifications that could frustrate even Antiochus and his well-equipped army. Certainly other sieges were known to take a long time. Polybius, of course, himself had experienced, essentially the entire Third Punic War as an extended siege of Carthage that the Romans can't quite pull off. So a 2-year siege isn't out of the question. It's also possible that this 2-year siege, again, wasn't bloody. That is, if Antiochus is simply consistently frustrated, unable to take the city by escalade, unable to find anyone to betray it, that he's kind of just encamped with his army for a while, but there isn't sufficient violence maybe to create the bad blood and might eventually enable these kind of friendly negotiations after a period of stalemate. This, of course, also may create the problem of how is Antiochus supplying his army, which by all accounts is very large. I think Justin puts it at about 110,000. I don't buy that, but I buy that it basically was as big as other royal armies, the ones we see at Magnesia or Raphia or Daphne, let's say 50 to 75,000. If that's the case, he's probably going to have to break them up at points. That is, if he's foraging, if he's requisitioning, even if he's starting to actually potentially try to re-provincialize Baktria and sort of create permanent mechanisms of exploitation, at some point he's probably going to have to divide that large a force simply because there's going to be no locale that can support them all. Think of what Caesar has to do at Gaul, eventually with an army that is about as big, maybe somewhat smaller. Every winter he's got to divide up his armies because there's no one location in Gaul that can feed them all. If Antiochus is doing that, you might almost have some kind of, let's say we accept the 2 years in Baktria, and again, that's conjecture. We might expect a dynamic maybe rather than one continuous 2-year siege of Antiochus having a go, getting frustrated, failing, having to disperse his army for supply, for wintering, coming again and having a go, and after a couple of bouts of this, getting tired and frustrated and being willing to have this kind of more friendly negotiation. I say that again, not necessarily to salvage the traditional chronology. I'm actually perfectly happy if someone would, if this project gets pursued and is published and completely, torpedoes the old chronology out of the water. I think that would be very interesting and even potentially very useful. I'm just saying that maybe consider option 4 could be the siege is long but not necessarily bloody, and most of the time it's Antiochus camping in Baktria rather than continuous siege operations. One just final note, and maybe this is just a bit of discussion in terms of sort of Graham's comments on Polybius 29. On one hand, this is a really puzzling and enigmatic passage, right? And it doesn't help that, yes, we seem to know about all of these other sieges other than Baktra, which is why there's been this inevitable temptation to, again, turn conjecture and then harden that conjecture into established fact. Polybius is really, his order is really odd here. Because on one hand, we have Tarentum, so the Roman siege, presumably 212 to 211. He then seems to sandwich Corinth, 146, and Carthage, 146, admittedly between at least 2 other sieges that Antiochus took place in. So these sieges clearly aren't listed chronologically, because Sardis would have been 214 to 213. Gaza is in 201, presumably. Assuming Gaza isn't Alexander the Great, and assuming it's the siege of Gaza that Antiochus undertook against Scopas, that would be in 201. So if that's the case, Polybius is clearly bouncing around, going from a siege in 212 to 211, to a siege in 146, to a siege in 214, 213, to a siege in 201. That said, it does seem he may be making a little Seleucid sandwich if we accept a siege of Gaza, going from Corinth, Carthage as the bread, and then in between 3 Seleucid sieges that he has talked about. I will say his ordering is a bit of a puzzle. A lot of it's out of order. I don't know if it's a slam dunk, however, to suggest that this should place this in 146 or 145. At least just from the Polybian passage alone. I'm perfectly open to, however, Polybius is aware that a major city has fallen, and sees this as, has read some kind of histrionic description, and somehow that makes it inside the sandwich between the 2 sieges that he's discussed. Although again, I think it's also perfectly, the reading this as a Seleucid siege is itself plausible. Again, I do really like how this presentation was organized around possibilities. A siege, no siege, or a successful siege, a downplayed siege, and maybe a very, very short, brief siege in which Antiochus then quickly retired. So again, I think just as we've learned a lot more about black holes in the past decade from careful study and listening to the sort of almost the sort of echoes of luminescence. I think this is worth doing further for the whatever took place in Baktra. And I really do hope to see this project further developed. And I think it will help to improve our understanding of Antiochus' analysis and also the dynamics of this of Seleucid power in the Eastern satrapies. So thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to respond to this fascinating presentation.
Thank you, Michael, so much. I'm not sure, but I guess that Ben wants to go first.
Okay, I'm always happy to. First of all, Michael, I think that was wonderful because here you wrote this wonderful book about it, and you're open. I really want to thank you for the intellectual openness that you just displayed. I think that that's a fantastic thing. Just a few notes because you said so much. First of all, you should know that the next project, which Graham hasn't seen yet because he's so busy, is to do the whole Eastern campaign and the chronology. Exactly, because a lot of what you responded to was, how does this fit into the Eastern campaign? And that is, you did exactly the logical next step that we're working on. And I appreciate it because this is something I'd gone back and forth with Altay a little bit about that the campaign probably wouldn't have started till that successor son Antiochus was named. And so what you did when you said that is, okay, if 210-209 is the starting point, and by the way, there's other evidence. There's a letter to Zeuxis, right? There's different appointments. There's sending Jewish settlers to Asia Minor. He seems to have put his house in order, and I have a whole section on this, before he left. So then that, as opposed to a lot of historians who say that the Anabasis was 212 to 206, that gives us a later starting point, which I think is what you had said, and which is very helpful because we're compressing time, and that's very helpful. Also, you mentioned about Parthia, and maybe more went on there. Well, a good evidence for what you said would be that mysterious siege. Remember, Antiochus III is besieging someplace, probably in Parthia. So when you said, to me, that was like magic when you said that. Maybe there's more to that Parthian campaign that we know. That the fact that he was besieging and abandons that siege to go to Baktria, right, indicates that yes, there was more going on there. And so it's a hint, but it's a pretty good hint, I think. Also, the idea that there was a lot in Baktria. Remember that Baktria is called the land of 1,000 cities. When you talk about that, maybe he had a lot. He was doing a lot of stuff, and Graham has mentioned sometimes, and I think you said it too. Maybe he could be besieging the city, but also be running around besieging other cities. That is, maybe that's sort of almost like a base, but he's going around. That is a possibility. But anyway, I'd really like to thank you because, and in terms of the project going on, the next project is exactly the campaign as a whole. That if we compress that 2 to 3 years back to, like, say, a year or something or a few months, how does that affect the whole chronology of the whole campaign?
Yes, I'd like to add to that you mentioned the Red Sea thing, but if that in a logical context makes more sense if he's doing that and sailing around rather than getting back and then heading off in the same direction he just came from anyway. But as Ben said, that's a later aspect. But then on the thing that you just went to, the list of cities, you mentioned the odd order. That affected us too, until it occurred to me that what Polybius is doing as he's writing this off the top of his head is going west to east and mentioning major sieges. So he's going Tarentum in Italy, Corinth in Greece, Sardis in Asia Minor, Gaza in Egypt, Bactra in the east, and then he goes back to the biggest of them all, Carthage, to end the whole thing. So there it doesn't matter necessarily what the dates are, and you don't have to worry about some are Seleucid and some aren't. He's just going off the top of his head saying these are the major cities of these areas as he's thinking geographically, and then goes back to Carthage to end with his main one. So that was our argument to cover that context. But yeah, as Ben echoed, I appreciate the openness and the resonating the ideas that we are still trying to tie in everything to make the bows neater, I guess. Good. We can open it up for
So,
questions now, probably.
well, thanks to all three of you. I guess there are more questions or suggestions from the audience. And as usual, while the audience is thinking about their questions or comments, I'd like to drop one or two myself. Starting with Ben's part, I am pretty much convinced that he's right, that there cannot have been a 2 to 3 year siege, and that's not in the evidence, and it's not even likely. When Michael, when you were trying to ponder what are the limits of possibilities and probabilities, you were trying to think of the possibility of a 1 to 2 year siege, comparing it with Carthage, but there you had different supply lines, as the Romans could easily be supplied overseas, which was just not the case for Antiochus, even though we do not know sufficiently about his supply lines, but it's very difficult to imagine that there were constant supplies from the center of the kingdom into the east. So that starting point is just very, very plausible. And looking at the sources, no ancient source does claim it. And then, as Michael has importantly pointed out, the challenge is to fill the gaps. And if the Parthian War can be extended plausibly, that would be a good pathway forward. So that's a very nice perspective for further research. Graham, as far as your attempt at reinterpreting the siege of Baktra goes, it's a very fascinating, widened perspective to look further to the east and further down the road, and then bring it back into the Polybian picture, having it end in or around 146. That's absolutely fascinating. And I think even if the date of 145 should be confirmed by whatever evidence, that should not be an obstacle, considering I just calculated we would be in the 158th Olympiad, ranging from 148 to 144 BCE. And then you have the different calendars that allow for overlaps and confusion. In fact, that so often confuse us even in Roman Republican, mid-Republican history. We have so many cases where we actually not know when it happened in this calendar year or in the next. And in fact, in the 2nd century, in the book of Maccabees, we have so many instances where we do not know whether the Macedonian or the Babylonian/Jewish reading of the Seleukid era was in place, and that causes a full calendar year of discrepancy. And even if there should not have been any of these discrepancies, when you have these changing geographical areas, well, more often than not, an author would not just limit himself by any kind of calendar year to finish off something that's nearly finished. In fact, if it's a side view onto something that was going on in the very far east, so it is a peripheral thing going on, but if it fits so well into the gloomy picture that Polybius must have depicted of what was going on in the Mediterranean world, so he would still have taken it in. So there I'm all with you. I do think, however, a tiny little bit more of chronological and literary or analytical work needs to be done. And probably it's quite easy. I do not remember all of Polybian scholarship right now. It's 15 years ago that I wrote an article where I argued that in a revision of his narrative of Book 30, Polybius added a note. So I do remember vaguely that most of the first 30 books were written and finished in the 150s. However, that then after the events, after all that had happened until 146, Polybius decided to add another 10 books. So in order to, well, extend the growth of the Roman Empire. And in that, and he may, I don't know exactly, but I think, well, towards the end of the 120s, or even 1 or 2 years later, 119-ish is perhaps the latest year reflected in there. And in the context of the extension, there were some revisions and updates. And I think we would all agree that the passage that you and Ben started with must be one of these updates in Book 29, second edition, because what else would be the siege of Carthage, which is in such a powerful position. But I'd be curious to understand the list, the previous list, or in fact the whole context a little bit more. Can we assume that the entire 12th chapter and what else is part of an edition or of the second edition is that criticism or that response to criticism given in that 12th chapter all a response to the first edition of the first 30 books? So can we be a little bit more precise? And especially when it's about Corinth, I don't remember all of the warfare of the diadoques and all the sieges and the many battlefields in through the 3rd century. Would we have an alternative, or are we bound by the year 146 as well for Corinth? With Gaza, of course, my first association was, of course, the ongoing war, but the second association would have been the Alexander siege of Gaza as a very big thing, and how big or little might have been Antiochus's siege of Gaza. So I wonder whether we can learn more, understand more when we look at the text, the 12th chapter in Book 29 in a more four-dimensional way. So bringing in the time, or in fact the 5th dimension, not just the time of the narrative, but also the time of the narration, and try to, well, solidify what actually these sieges were, whether there has been a first list and possibly a second list that might have been extended from hindsight in the second edition of the book. So that's what I'm still musing about.
Can I just respond quickly to 3 points? One is, I do think that Gaza is Antiochus III's siege, because he mentions it in a couple of places. He's apparently very taken with the loyalty and the bravery of the people of Gaza. So I still think that that's right. I also like to mention, in terms of when you say about, how Graham got to, and then when I say that Graham took this to a place that I never would have gone to, I'm so stuck sort of in the specialization of Greek stuff. When Graham came up with this thing that it could have been Chinese coming there, that was a lightning moment for me, because I just never would have gotten to that, because I think we're all, and Altay, I think you referred to this, right? We're all sort of stuck within certain parameters. And so when Graham did that, that was an incredible thing. But Altay, I'm very taken with what you just said. Now, taking that first passage that I cited, why is he saying that at all? And what you just said, I think, was very helpful. It does feel like, he's defending himself. I mean, why is he writing that passage? So he said, you know what, you shouldn't take me to task if I haven't done it. It sounds like that is like a second edition, like almost a preface to a second edition or something like that. Because why is he defending himself if this was part of the first thing? It does sound like he was getting criticized. I never saw the passage that way. And that's very helpful.
Thanks, Ben. So anyone else from the audience, please just share your ideas. Yes, Ben, please.
Hiya. Sorry, there might be a bit of noise in the background. There's a couple of guys clearing out some bins outside. So my question is more to do with like the campaign as a whole. So I had a meeting this morning with my supervisor, and I was talking specifically about the Seleukid use of cataphracts, and obviously, in terms of Polybian narrative, that doesn't really show up until his criticism of Zeno's passage about Panion. And I was very much coming from Duplessis and Barkokva's sort of argument that, well, they had this campaign in the east, and then Antiochus really liked the idea of the cataphract, and then kind of took that back with him to Syria, to the Fifth Syrian War, etc. And I got challenged to sort of think about, okay, well, maybe that's possible, but maybe look more nuanced, maybe because obviously the peace deal between Bactria and the Seleukid Empire, there's this mention of this trade of elephants as like a peace offering. Is there any evidence to suggest that maybe cataphracts may have had something to do with this peace deal? Like maybe alongside the elephants, maybe Antiochus had got given access to some of the Bactrian, or maybe in the context of the Parthian campaign, maybe some of the Parthian cataphracts?
Do you want to answer that, Ben, or not?
We don't know anything about with the Parthians, but if you're saying, Ben, that he learned from these campaigns and he was being attacked by cataphracts from the Bactrian cataphracts, we all learned from the campaigns that we're involved in. So that's very plausible.
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible that the ongoing agreement between the two kings was not just what he had to give at the time, which Michael and Altay mentioned the logistics, a supply train. Obviously, the corn was a key part of that peace treaty, and we go into detail on that in the paper too. But the ongoing arrangement that must have been the case was likely cataphracts serving in the Seleucid army, rather than necessarily, it's not listed that they came at that moment, but presumably as a part of the Seleucid Empire, Euthydemus would have had to give levies of troops to the main Seleucid army, and so cataphracts could conceivably have started arriving, from 205 onwards, when Antiochus gets back and Euthydemus then has to send troops with him. So yeah, I agree. I think that that's part of the treaty that was signed in this context, that these cataphracts had to be used from there onwards.
Thank you. Next comes John Serrati.
Aaron and Stan had their hands up too. Just
Hi, thanks. Thanks so much for the wonderful and important lecture, Ben and Graham, and thanks, Michael, for the response. I'd like to ask a little bit about the bigger picture of Antiochus III and his reception as a general, because I've noticed in scholarship lately, a couple of articles, a PhD for which I was the external examiner. There's been an effort to really rehabilitate his reputation as a general, to say that actually he was almost the second coming of Alexander, and he gets really bad press. But then, of course, you run into Magnesia and the complete disaster that is the Syrian war. So I'm wondering if what can we extrapolate from today? Do you think there is a cause for rehabilitating his reputation, or is it, the old chestnut of, yes, the Anabasis is this very successful campaign, but he's got a good military force fighting against he's got a professional military force, and he's fighting against amateurs, and then when he comes up against Rome, he gets absolutely hammered. So how does in essence, my question is, how does this nuance our reception of his reputation and his generalship?
Well, as you probably know, sorry, Ben, but as you know, in my book, I take him to task for his inadequate generalship. So I think as a young king, he was riding on the coattails of his generals and had a tendency to do stupid things like riding off with his cavalry, like a lot of people did before and since. Um, but that the Nabasis was successful because of our evidence. I'm not entirely sure how much of that is down to Antiochus versus the command system he had in place with professional officers like Zeuxis, who was a very good general, and others who were helping him through it as such. And then he gets his reputation through this propaganda that Ben mentioned. When he gets out of the campaign, he's given the great name, and then he gets inflated as the second coming of Alexander. Whereas I personally think it's more his officers are helping him through it rather than necessarily him having the same personal level that Alexander had, to get to that far. But
I would add, I would say, John, all of the above, right? He was all of those things. But a lot of his successes were not military. That is, you bring a huge army and you make a deal. And I tried to put it in at one point, and it's more expanded in one of these two papers, right? You know, he comes up with a big army, and he was always more happier, I should say, to make a deal. Sounds like somebody in power right now. But anyway, to make a deal than to fight, right? Which might mean that he knew some of his own, limitations and everything. So I think that there were moments of brilliance, and there are moments, like Graham's point, of complete failure. So whenever somebody says he was this or he was that, that's like, he has a long career. And there was some of this of great successes, and there were some total failures. So I think to ever be one-sided about a long career, like for any of us, right? We have our successes and we have our failures.
If I may add to this,
I tend to be, I agree with you both completely. I tend to be in that camp where yeah, his reputation is his reputation for a reason. And I think both of you, in particular, Graham, in your book, you make a really strong argument for that. So yeah.
If I may add to this, and building on something that Ben also said in his presentation, if we just look at the facts, the pure facts that we have, so 2 to 3 years coming out of Baktria with a crushed jaw, and not even having subjected the king. So there was a lot of, diplomacy or propaganda required to make it look like not a failure, but in fact something that comes close to a victory. Had he invested this time and the resources into further campaigning, who knows what else he might have had achieved. So I do think that the Bactrian campaign is about the least successful part of the Anabasis. And in fact, we do not gain really the impression that he is a great general in that time, even though, I do think there is more propaganda in the exaltation of the battle at the Arius River, because, he gets injured and he doesn't catch the king. So
and he has to be saved by somebody else.
I was about to say that his subordinate comes and saves the day.
Yeah, right. So that does not help him really to establish his military clout. That I find a little bit odd, that this battle is the best military achievement. But then I very often think, like Ben, that political and diplomatic achievements are of much more powerful and yield more lasting results. So that is what I see as his great strength, until he blunders politically when it's in the conflict with the Romans towards the very end. He miscalculates there, and that is what cost him so much. So that would be my nuance. Militarily, at least the little that we have, the scraps that we have, that's militarily disastrous, in my opinion.
I mean, I guess my own assessment is, for a Hellenistic king, he punches above his weight. I mean, for a Seleucid king, he punches above his weight. I think that's fair to say. I think the downside is I'm becoming increasingly convinced that Hellenistic kingship is just ultimately a relatively brittle form of governance. And that many of the weaknesses are the weaknesses of Hellenistic kingship, including militarily. I mean, all Antiochus tries to do is the Alexander battle. Fix with your infantry, and then you gallantly charge with your own cavalry, just like Alexander did. And he did that at Raphia. He's trying to do that at the Arius River and gets hit with a rock. And then he tries to do that at Magnesia. And the problem is to the extent that the Alexander battle works, that's great, but it frequently doesn't. And I think a lot of the other things is he does what Hellenistic kings can do relatively well. Mostly, basically, do you want to marry my daughter? I mean, that is the constant offer. I mean, he's basically doing this kingship diplomacy. But I think he's ultimately brought down by some of the just inherent weaknesses of that institution. There just are a lot of actually, I think, limits what you can do when you're fundamentally a kind of conqueror perched on a lot of spear won land.
I wonder if Aaron wanted to say something earlier.
Yeah, I have a lot of comments. I really enjoyed this, and I'm glad to see you get deep in the weeds. Stop apologizing for getting deep in the weeds. I'm here for the weeds. So a couple of questions, but I also have a possibility 5 that I get to. But I think it's really useful to think of Antiochus as thinking of himself as Alexander. What would Alexander do is just kind of like his modus operandi, this entire operation. And I don't think we necessarily need to see him as being present at all of these places. That is, what would Alexander do? It's like he will leave his generals behind with a force to prosecute a siege or invest a hill fort, and he'll keep moving, right? If you look at the Anabasis, right? Alexander splits his forces all the time. He splits them into Zagros. He splits them in Anatolia. He besieges cities along the coast to go off and run around Egypt. Right? He has to keep moving, right? And if Antiochus thinks that this is how you win this campaign, it's like, I leave people here, I leave people here, I leave people here, I go off to India, I go off to Arabia. And I do think that there is a problem with the latter bit of that campaign where there's only these scraps of remarks, but he's marching 2 months to India and he's marching like 8 months to Arabia and he's pulling it off with 1 year and making big deals with every place along the way. I don't think you can have a 2 to 3 year siege in Bactria and a negotiation with the king of India and a negotiation Gerha in Arabia all in the time allotted, unless he has divvied some of this up to his representatives to pull off, and he's just getting the credit for it because he's the king. So like maybe he just sends an ambassador to India, doesn't go himself personally, or he leaves his generals to besiege cities in Bactria while he goes off and does his diplomatic stuff. I think that might be a useful possibility 5. I think it's pretty similar to what Michael was saying earlier.
Okay, but the only thing is, Aaron, I don't feel, I mean, common sense wise, I get what you're saying, but I don't see any evidence of that, of any kind of split of his army in any way.
Well, he left behind people to prosecute the siege when he went to fight the Battle of Arius, but that's the only concrete evidence we have of that. Presumably, he's doing it in other places too, and he.
I thought he abandoned it and he just moved one force faster than the other, than the rest.
Well, he personally abandoned it. It's not entirely clear from the Greek whether he abandoned it himself to take the troops or if he left the siege in prosecution while he went to the Arius. But either way, there's, as you say, there's not much evidence for it happening anywhere else. But common sense would suggest he did split his forces. But I agree that I think this is what we're still writing on now. But part of it is that he can't. I don't think he can travel from India back in whatever it's supposed to be, 8 months or 9 months or a year that it's supposed to take him to get back from India to Babylon if you have your 2-month siege of Baktra, whether he's doing the sieges or not. If he winters in Carmania, and he's got a couple of years to get back. So anyway, but yes, it's an interesting thought that he he probably did leave contingents at sieges, certainly minor sieges, I would think. Though I do think he would meet the kings by himself in India and in other places. So
That'd be my inclination too.
yeah.
The other question I really have is what do you think about Demetrius the First, that is the Seleucid one, who is probably one of Polybius's main shapers, sources for this narrative? Obviously, he's too young to know about it directly, but like they hang out, right? Polybius and Demetrius as hostages in Rome, and it's like, oh yeah, about my grandfather's campaign in Bactria. So like, you haven't mentioned, what effect Demetrius might have on the text of Polybius. Is like, is that part of why we might have a more positive Antiochus?
Absolutely. That's what we're calling Seleukid propaganda. Absolutely.
We didn't name drop Demetrius, but that's we should do. We will do in the published version. But yes, that's a valid point.
I have one more comment if I can. There is a Babylonian chronicle that is talking about Antiochus's campaign in Baktra, but it's Antiochus the First. But I don't think there are particularly many details in that chronicle that really do say that it is Antiochus the First. I'm not an expert on that chronicle at all, but it might be worth poking into if you're not familiar with it, because it does describe Antiochus the First marching into Bactria in India and coming away with a bunch of elephants to fight his other wars. And maybe that's been attributed to Antiochus the First, and it maybe belongs to Antiochus the Third.
Good. I didn't know that. Thank you.
Well, that sounds interesting, and I can't relate to it, so I seize the opportunity that I see Nicholas amongst us, our Acadianist. Do you know anything about it to help us out here?
So I actually have it in front of me right now because I had those already opened since Michael kind of referred to one. It's the problem with the specific chronicle, as with almost all these chronicles, is that they're very damaged. So there is some reference to Seleukos and then Bactria, the assumption of elephants coming from there, because we know this from other later chronicles that they do get elephants from these regions. But I think it's very difficult to kind of base anything on this. This is especially with these chronicles. I mean, they're written by Babylonian priests who know about this vaguely, but who aren't really interested in what's happening, except in Babylon. And then the tablets are just very, very much damaged. Although the edition by Van der Spek and Finkel should be out or coming out soon, finally, after decades. So maybe they have some more interesting comments, and maybe they will have had some new readings, because the one I'm working on is already a bit older.
Thanks a lot for this edition. So we continue waiting with a lot of anticipation of the final edition of the Babylonian Chronicles. Good. Any other comments, questions?
I think Stanley had his hand up at one point.
Please go ahead, Stanley.
Okay. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that the siege is short and not 2 to 3 years. And it's important, the reference to the fact that Antiochus gave up a siege to confront Euthydemus at Taurius. There's one piece of evidence that wasn't brought in, and on Zariaspa, because we do know from Strabo that Eratosthenes, who's 3rd century, close to Antiochus, used Zariaspa as a synonym for Baktra. And Polybius knows that geography as well, so that unless we are going to assume Polybius uses an unusual as being odd. When he says Euthydemus withdrew to Zariaspa, what he is saying is that Euthydemus withdrew to Baktra. So that any siege has to be, you might say, in Book 11, which is where you are. And it's going to be, as you pointed out, rather short because of the length of time involved to move the armies back there. That's one problem. There's another one that bothers me about the whole passage in Book 29, which has gotten odder and odder as people talk about it. What Polybius says there is that other historians have described all of these sieges at length. Now, some of them are sieges, I think, from way back. The siege at Tarentum, the capture of Tarentum, is the Roman capture in the Pyrrhic Wars. I don't know what Haliartus is, but it's clearly a Greek mainland siege of some sort. But this raises an interesting question. We know something about Polybius' account of Carthage. And it was certainly not my perfunctory account. Appian uses it. It has a sentimental discussion of conversations with Scipio Aemilianus and so on. I am wondering whether we may be too hung up on what we know as opposed to what we don't. Polybius would have extended his history from Book 30, which had to be written in the 150s, and he would have started the extension sometime after the 140s. How many other histories with detailed accounts of the captures of Corinth and Carthage were there available in the relatively short period between the 140s and his death for him to be referring to them? We don't know. In fact, I don't think we know of any. That's not saying there weren't. I'm wondering if he's referring to something earlier. This is just an idea I'm throwing out. One other minor thing, Peyton makes an error in the translation of the passage in Book 11 about Tellius, which is why they suggest that supplement. The passage begins Kai-gar, but he leaves out the Kai in the translation. He simply jumps for Euthydemus. There's the grammar in that first couple of sentences means that there has to be something that goes before.
Right.
An introduction. If for Euthydemus also was from Magnesia is what it seems to be saying.
Yeah.
And the pros hon also. So that the supplement is sensible. It's obviously not Polybius. You can't quote the supplement. But saying that there must have been an introduction of Tellius as a Magnesian strikes me as a reasonable interpretation.
But then Stanley, one of the questions, you must be right, but then the question is, why emphasize that fact, right? Why emphasize that connection? So one of the things I was trying to say is that, it's like if these two guys knew each other, from way back. I mean, I have a whole thing I'm developing about a Magnesian connection, but I won't go into that. Then that sort of gives it a certain spirit. Okay, you're old friends. Go talk. Let's work this out. Let's figure this out. why emphasize the name of that emissary at all and that connection unless you're trying to make a point?
Well, clearly, I think the point is that I wouldn't add he's a friend from way back. That's reading more into it.
Okay.
I think Polybius has. There is something genuinely peculiar here, because this isn't the way Polybius normally handles this. What's peculiar is in book 10, we've already got a reference to Euthydemus with no identification. I mean, Polybius would normally identify who these people are relevant. There probably was more about Baktra earlier than we have. In short, the excerpts we have are not the whole thing, as we know.
Right.
At this point, I suspect all that Polybius wanted to point out is Antiochus sent an emissary who would be suitable, partly because they were fellow countrymen,
Right.
not go any further than that.
Okay, that's fair.
Especially since I suspect the whole siege lasts, as you've all been well arguing, maybe at most a year, 6 months to a year. Polybius' point seems to be an awful lot of dramatizing sieges that don't need it. But those were the things that struck me.
Thank you.
So thank you, Stanley. The good thing is that we are recording, so that the presenters have an opportunity to go back to all the feedback that was given and work through it. And thanks also, Niklas, for your update. I now see that the chronicles have been published last month, so that's very precious news to many of us, and a good point to end our meeting today. So thank you all for presenting, discussing, attending, especially Ben, Graham, and Michael. And I look forward to seeing many of you either in Utrecht in November or as of January again in our lecture series. So may you all have an enjoyable summer.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.